Welcome to On Trust, Stories from the Front Line in Lagoon GHI by Jamil Farshchi. During the question session, please use the microphones in the aisles. And with that, let us welcome our speaker.
Thanks. Hey y'all, how you doing this morning? Good. I appreciate you braving the heat and maybe hangovers as well, depending on how late you stayed out last night, to come for this talk. I'm going to talk about On Trust, and then we're going to go through some of the experiences that I've had throughout my career leading up to the Equifax situation. To start off, I want to talk about a day that I will not ever forget, and that day was September 7th, 2017. Started off like any other normal day, but it wasn't long after I got into the office that morning that I get a phone call coming from my CEO, and immediately starts grilling me on a variety of things. Right? Hey, 150 million records compromised. What's the data sensitivity? Do we have any interconnection? What are the risks that we have? It was a pretty trying time, and as a CISO, you never really want to get that phone call to begin with, right? And then that led to the next discussion, which was board members asking the same types of questions, the team, getting into a frenzy and running all over the place to try to get as many answers as they can to the situation. So the net of it was a very chaotic and crazy time. September 7th, 2017. What's really crazy about it, though, is that I was not at Equifax at this time. I was at that company with the big orange sign, the mecca for do-it-yourselfers. I was at Home Depot. And despite the fact that we had our own breach in 2015, which I was in the middle of driving the transformation for, the Equifax breach caused us a lot of pain. Why? Because Equifax was one of our customers. So from a customer perspective, my level of trust in that organization was meaningfully impacted, as was for all of the other employees, boards of directors, and so forth throughout the organization. But it wasn't just that. It wasn't just the customer aspect. Personally, I was a victim myself, so my information was compromised during that breach. But more importantly to me was the fact that my daughter, who I had had not too long before that, had just received her first little Social Security number, and it's a pretty cool little time to see this little thing, and you think, oh, she's like a real person now. And one of the first things I thought was, my gosh, this breach is going to impact this, and her credentials or her information is already compromised. So it was truly impactful, and my level of trust in the organization was meaningfully impacted as a result of that. So I'm sure that many of you in this room have had similar stories and had similar impacts as I did, but the impacts weren't just as it relates to the person or to the customer. Equifax was meaningfully impacted as well. So right out of the gate, you have a 40% loss in your market cap. You have the CEO, the CSO, the CTO, all gone from the organization. You make an incremental investment of $1.25 billion. It's a lot of money to be able to reinvest in the technology and security of the organization. And then you have all of the scrutiny. And so we dealt with a whole host of investigations as a result of the breach itself. One such investigation led me earlier this year, myself and my CEO, it was in February, led us to Washington, D.C., to the Dirksen building up there, and it was for congressional testimony for the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. And when I'm in this meeting, you're sitting there and at the desk, and you've got all these cameras in front of you and the reporters and stuff, and you look up, and the way they set these things up is pretty intimidating. So all the senators are sitting above you, looking down. But right out of the gate, first question I get is, how many certificates were expired in 2017? Right, so they're looking into the past and trying to piece that together. The next question I get is, what have you done to improve your patching processes since we believe patching was a critical weakness for your organization? And then another one would be, if you had an outstanding asset inventory, would you have been able to stop this breach from occurring? Right, so going into the speculative piece. Now these questions are all meaningful, and I think they're all fine. And quite frankly, in my role, I get these questions from the media, from the regulators, from our insurance underwriters, from customers, and so forth. So these aren't bad questions, and they're fairly common. I think the key thing, though, is are they the right questions? Does it really matter when you talk about these specific controls? Does it really get to the heart of what's really going on within our industry as a whole? And to answer that, I believe that I figured this out far earlier in my career. I didn't learn this at Equifax. I didn't learn it at Home Depot. It actually goes back to my first job after I finished college, and it was at NASA. And so in 2003, I'm at NASA, and we have what I believe to be the greatest crisis I've ever faced within an organization. And it wasn't a breach. It wasn't a breach. It was the 2003 Shuttle Columbia disaster, where we lost 7 outstanding individuals by virtue of that event. Now, in the wake of that event, they put together an investigation board, and they went through all of the different causes and identified all of the different weaknesses within the situation to be able to identify the root cause. And so the initial outcome is, okay, look, you're getting ready to launch. As you're going through that process, you have a piece of foam insulation falls off the external tank, hits the left wing, damaging it. And then later on, upon reentry, because of that damaged wing, you get excess heat, which then cascades throughout the shuttle and disintegrates it upon reentry. It was terrible. And so this is all documented in that report. But there is one very, very important conclusion that they make in that report that I think is extraordinarily relevant to all of us here today. And what they said, and I think if there's anything you take away from this talk, just remember this. What they said was, at NASA, an accident was inevitable. So think about that for a minute. It was inevitable. Didn't matter if it was the Columbia or it was going to be the Atlantis for the next launch. Didn't matter if it was because of foam insulation or because of some propulsion issue. An accident was inevitable. Why was it inevitable? Well, they said it directly in there. Organizational structure and decision processes were such that it was going to happen. Something bad was going to happen. And what does that speak to? That speaks to the culture of the organization. It doesn't speak to the specific controls, it speaks to the culture. And I think that's a critical piece as we look at the breaches and we look at the landscape that we're seeing today. If we focus just on the individual controls that failed, I think we're missing the bigger picture. So a few months ago, I was talking to a CEO of a major financial institution. And he goes, Jamil, I'm not a technical guy, so how will I know if I have an effective security organization? And I think it's a great question, honestly, and I think it's one of these things that as a security leader and many of us have to deal with consistently is trying to sort of bridge that divide between the technical aspects and communicating it to a non-technical audience. So what I told him was there's 5 things I think that really matter to be able to help to identify whether you're going to have a successful security program or not. The first one is your head of security or CISO, are they positioned in the organization such that they have the ability to influence the entire enterprise? The reason this is important because security is everybody's responsibility. If it's just the security team that's doing security, then you're bound to fail. And you need that level of authority to be able to push down throughout the entire enterprise. The second one is, does the head of security have regular interaction and communications with the board of directors? Now this is essential because you need to be able to manage up. You need to be able to communicate what those key risks are. Otherwise they're going to get buried and they're not going to be addressed to the degree that they should. The third one is about incentives. And there's a lot of organizations out there that sort of check the box as it relates to security. And either you have nothing, or some organizations will have sort of part of the annual review process, you'll have a little blurb in there about security. It doesn't really tie into any kind of meaningful economic incentives. The organizations I think they're doing this really well are the ones that have taken security and aligned it economically from a performance standpoint, just like almost all organizations do as it relates to top line growth or bottom line growth or your margins or your EBITDA. These things are essential and they're critical, and so if you tie that economic impact back into the performance of your security program, it puts you in a far better place. The next one is crisis management. Are you doing consistent crisis management exercises with the executive leadership team and the board of directors? If you're not, what it tells me is that you don't think a breach is ever going to happen, right? It's the same reason that I put on a seatbelt every single time I get into a car. It's because I know it's possible that I'm going to get in an accident, and I want to do at least the minimum amount to ensure that I'm protecting myself. If organizations aren't testing these things, then they fundamentally don't believe it's going to happen to them. And as we know, it can happen to anyone at any time. And the final one ties back to risk management. Has your organization ever halted or delayed a critical enterprise initiative because of security or privacy? This is a critical one because what it speaks to is the fact that if you have done this, you have the right governance processes in place to be able to identify these risks and escalate them. And it means that your management, the CEO, the leadership team, whomever, has the conviction to actually do something about it. They have the conviction to not take advantage of an immediate opportunity that's going to give you maybe an incremental dollar of revenue, and instead do the right thing and focus on the risk to the organization. So I think these are all absolutely critical pieces. Now, think about your organizations and tell me whether you check the box on all 5 of those things. It's likely that you don't, because that's just the state of our environment today. But if you do, my argument is, even with a mediocre security team, if you have all 5 of those things checked, you have a far better chance of success. You can have the best security team ever, but if you don't have those 5 things on top of you in place, then the likelihood that you're going to be successful as a team is pretty darn low, no matter how good you are, because you're not going to have the ability to be able to drive change. Now, if you look at the studies today, most studies will say one of the top 3 things that any organization, that any board of directors or CEO cares about is going to be cybersecurity. It's crazy. I mean, with all the geopolitical risks, with the competitive challenges the organizations have, with the labor issues, cybersecurity consistently reaches one of the top 3 things. So everyone says that it's really important, right? But what really matters to me is what are you going to do about it? It's easy to talk. It's easy to say, hey, cyber keeps me up at night, privacy keeps me up at night, but actually doing something about it, putting some of these pieces in place, takes effort. And as a result, what we're seeing is a lot of people talking about things, but not actually doing them. And so there's this saying called say do that we've implemented at our company, and it comes from our CEO. When he started, we started about the same time after the breach, and he's like, look, say do is absolutely essential. We can talk all we want, but if we say something, we have got to deliver on it. And it's that level of action that I think drives the meaningful level of progress that we've seen. And I think if more companies chose to do that, we wouldn't be in the situation in many cases that we are today. Now, it's equally important to note that the environment is just getting more and more challenging, right? Every organization is critically tied into technology, and they're critically reliant on technology. And as we all know, technology underpins virtually everything within organizations nowadays, and technology is inherently insecure. I mean, you can have something that has 0 weaknesses today, and I guarantee you tomorrow it will have something, right? Couple that with the reliance on data that we have, and you have a perfect storm where you've got this reliance on technology, and you have all these massive amounts of data being created, and so we become infinitely attractive targets, all of us, to the bad guys. And then you marry up a new dynamic, privacy, something that consumers in general, I think for the longest time have been pretty apathetic about, are now starting to actually care. And as a result, you have regulations and regulators coming in to be able to drive that as well. So it's only going to continue to get harder for us to be successful. Now, let me tell you a story for me that was extraordinarily difficult. I was at Los Alamos National Laboratories, and I was the CISO there several years back. And for those of you who don't know, it's a nuclear weapons laboratory. And so obviously our risk tolerance is extraordinarily low. And you face some of the most advanced threats that are out there. And one day we got hit, and the adversary penetrated our perimeter, and so they got in. Now, fortunately for us, we were able to watch them as they came in, and we were able to do some meaningful analysis. And for those of you who don't know, in organizations like this, oftentimes you don't want to just kick them out. You want to monitor them and try to learn from them to try to understand sources and stuff like that. And so we do. And after analysis, we identified that there was multiple teams coming after us. They were running different shifts. We isolated the origin of those attacks and who the threat actors were. And eventually they got far enough into the organization that we said, okay, now there's too much risk. We're gonna kick these guys out. So we did that and wiped our hands of it, and that was a good news story. The next morning, though, I get a phone call from a peer of mine at a different laboratory, and he says, "Jamil, can you, we've been popped. Can you please send some of your cyber folks over here to help us out with the situation?" And of course, I'm like, "Sure, great." So we sent them over there, and what ended up happening is that it was so bad, they ended up having to pull the plug from the entire internet for the entire laboratory for 2 full weeks. It was that bad. The interesting thing, though, is that when we went through and did the analysis, what turns out happened is that both organizations, mine as well as his, were both attacked at the exact same time. And when we stopped the attacker on our side, they diverted all of those resources and essentially amplified that attack on this other organization. Now, this is we hear this thing about outrunning the bear. Right? You guys have probably all heard this. You see a bear in the woods, you don't have to outrun it. As long as you outrun your friend, they'll get eaten, you're good to go. Right? Yeah, it's a great graphical image in your mind. So we've heard this, and this was the first time in my career that I'd actually seen direct evidence supporting this. Right? After this occurred, I thought, geez, not only did we succeed here because we stopped these guys, we actually excelled because they got hit even harder, and so that makes us even better. And this was a huge mistake on my part. This is a big mistake because I looked at a certain set of outcomes and a certain set of data points, and I concluded one thing. But what I didn't realize at the time was that neither one of us won. Right? I didn't win. I wasn't successful because they got hit. And as a result of that, we both ended up losing this fight. And this is why I think it's so critical that we all work together to be able to raise the bar for organizations. Like if you look at things like privacy today, you have 1 or 2 organizations that maybe weren't doing the right thing. And as a result of those weaknesses, the entire industry, anyone who's related, any organization tied into privacy has been lumped in to that same bucket, whether or not they were doing good or not. The same thing applies to security. I can't think of anything worse than if one of my direct competitors was compromised, which is why we work so hard to partner with them so that we're make sure we're all raising the bar to the best degree possible. And let's be honest, does it provide any benefit to anybody if we have breaches like Marriott or the Capital One or anything like that? It doesn't help anybody. And so we tend to be, in this industry, we tend to try to focus on all the bad and point the finger and say, oh, well, they should have had this control in place or that control in place. What we should be doing is working more closely with each other to be able to help raise that bar for everybody. Because if we can do that, when we see that bear, it's not going to be about us trying to outrun the person next to us, because the reality is if that person gets eaten that's next to you, you're the next target for that bear. But if we work together, we have a fighting chance to be able to avoid any meaningful impact negatively for all parties involved. And with that, I want to close on, I think, what the most important part is. Trust starts and ends with you. I have worked in a lot of places, and I've worked with a lot of individuals. We can operate in such a way that we focus more, we're like a Pollyanna, right? Everything's fine, it'll all work out. We can be, the boy who cried wolf and say, escalate everything possible until it all becomes noise and leadership doesn't even listen to us anymore because of all the security issues we see. That's tempting sometimes, honestly, because there's a lot of vulnerabilities out there. So we can take that approach, or what we can do is we can say, look, even though I maybe don't have control over the board of directors or how exactly where I report within my organization, what we can do is we can look inside ourselves and we can say, do I embody the right attributes? Am I truly focused and am I embodying the attributes of the culture that I want to build, and do that day in and day out? I think if we all take this position, if we can work together on these challenges that we all face, let's be honest, they're all the same kind of challenges. And then we push for the kind of culture, and we start with ourselves. We fight for it tooth and nail, day in and day out, make that incremental level of progress. And then we partner together. Then I think we have a meaningful shot at being able to turn the tide that we've been facing today. And if we do that, not only do I think that we will be successful, but I think all of us collectively have an opportunity to excel. That's my talk. I appreciate the time. If there are any questions you guys have, I want to offer the opportunity for my team to work directly with yours in this partnership fashion. So please reach out via LinkedIn or send me an email or whatever, and we can work together, because I think we can turn the tide as a collective group. Have a great rest of the week, and thank you very much.